The first 5 minutes at Clearwater Lake were supposed to be peaceful. Trevor Caldwell had just pulled his truck into the gravel driveway of his new cabin, excited, exhausted, and ready to start the next chapter of his life. The keys were still warm in his pocket, and the sun filtered through the trees with a calm he hadn't felt in years. He'd finally escaped the chaos of city life. But before a single box was unloaded, a figure stepped in front of his vehicle, like she owned the entire forest. Brenda Thornfield, tall, stone-faced, wearing heels on gravel, and a blazer far too corporate for a lakeside community. She didn't offer a hello. She didn't ask his name. She simply barked, "You can't park here. This is private property. Where's your moving permit?" Trevor blinked. "Ma'am, I just bought this cabin." Her jaw tightened. "Not without HOA approval, you didn't." Trevor reached into the glove compartment and handed her the deed, the signed purchase agreement, and even his driver's license. She barely looked at them. "These could be forged," she said. "You're trespassing. This is fraud." Before he could respond, she pulled out her phone and dialed 911. "Yes, I'd like to report a theft in progress. A large truck is removing items from a property in Lakeside Estates. I believe it's a scam." Trevor stood there, stunned, as she gave the dispatcher his license plate number. Neighbors watched from their porches and windows, some out of curiosity, others with caution. One older man across the road took one look and slowly retreated back into his house, pulling the curtains shut. Something was off here. 20 minutes later, a patrol car pulled in. Sergeant Mike O'Brien stepped out, sunglasses on, looking equal parts annoyed and unsurprised. "Brenda," he said flatly. "Again?" Trevor handed him the documents. The sergeant read them, compared the names, then looked Trevor up and down. "This all checks out," he said. "You're the owner." Brenda crossed her arms. "He's lying." O'Brien turned to her. "No crimes being committed here. Showing up and moving in is exactly how property ownership works." Brenda's face didn't change. "This isn't over," she whispered, as the patrol car pulled away. "We have rules, and you're already breaking them." Trevor, still holding a cardboard box full of dishes, glanced up at the old wooden HOA sign. It looked warped and weather-beaten. Deep scratches marred the surface, like someone had taken a metal object to it out of rage. He had a strange, heavy feeling in his gut. This wasn't just about HOA rules. This was about control. And the woman trying to enforce it didn't seem the least bit rational. He looked around. The houses were well kept but eerily quiet. No kids, no dogs, no neighborly hellos, just closed blinds and locked doors. Not exactly the lake life he'd envisioned. He set the box down slowly. Maybe this wasn't just a case of a Karen on a power trip. Maybe this was something deeper, something darker. And as he would soon learn, Brenda Thornfield wasn't just a problem. She was the problem. And this HOA? It wasn't what it claimed to be. The first violation notice arrived 2 days after Trevor moved in. It was slipped under his door, no envelope, no explanation. Just a printed notice with bold red text. Unauthorized vehicle parking. Fine $500. It referenced a subsection of the community rules Trevor had never seen before. Confused, he went back to the original CCNRs, the covenants, conditions, and restrictions that were given to him during closing. That subsection didn't exist. Brenda had made it up. He thought maybe it was a mistake, some admin error. He'd parked the truck in his driveway for just over 24 hours during unloading. Hardly a crime. But the tone of the notice wasn't bureaucratic. It was punitive, intentionally vague and severe. It wasn't trying to inform. It was trying to scare. Then came the second notice. Exterior finish non-compliance. $350 fine. The offense? His cabin's cedar stain. Not compliant with visual standards, it read. The wood finish was natural, high quality, and already used on at least 15 other homes in the community. Trevor walked the neighborhood, took pictures, and found almost identical finishes on cabins just across the street. There was no inconsistency, except one. His was the only one being fined. And then came the third notice, the one that changed everything. Aggressive surveillance activity and social disruption. $300 fine. It accused him of engaging in behavior that causes intimidation to other residents, including walking the neighborhood at night and using a phone flashlight in a threatening manner. It even described his greetings as suspiciously friendly, which apparently created unease. Trevor laughed when he read it, at first. Then the fear crept in. This wasn't just mismanagement. This was psychological manipulation. The language of the notices was surgical. Enough legal-sounding jargon to sound legitimate, but loaded with vagueness designed to be irrefutable. There was no appeals process, no contact number, just a P.O., box, and an expectation to pay. He realized Brenda wasn't disorganized, she was deliberate. Trevor's journalist instincts flared. He'd spent years investigating local politics and corruption, but he'd never expected to live inside one of his own stories. This wasn't amateur harassment, it was methodical, and it was working, not just on him, but on the whole neighborhood. He began researching. The last legal version of the CC&Rs, filed in 1987, was basic. No excessive noise after 10 p.m., no external additions without approval, maintain your yard, nothing about paint colors, nothing about walking after dark, nothing about human interaction. What Brenda had done was build a parallel rulebook, mimicking the original formatting, stamping the HOA logo on it, and enforcing it with fabricated authority. He cross-referenced old documents and found that the HOA's legal registration had lapsed over 2 years ago. In other words, the HOA was a ghost, and Brenda was its self-appointed dictator. He kept a log, every violation, every note, every date and detail. He built a spreadsheet matching violations to made-up rules, and he wasn't the only one targeted. Trevor started knocking on doors. Many stayed closed. Some opened just wide enough to whisper, "Be careful." A few brave ones shared their stories. One of them was Garrett Fleming, a retired civics teacher. Trevor expected to chat on the porch, but Garrett pulled him inside and locked the door. Garrett showed him the violations he'd received: $250 for excessive wind chimes, $175 for non-harmonious solar lighting, and a handwritten note saying that gardening outside of designated hours disrupted community rhythm. "She's made me afraid of my own garden," Garrett said. "I taught government for 30 years. I've seen authoritarianism, but I never thought I'd see it from a woman with a clipboard and a file folder." Another neighbor, Melanie Cross, had been fined for visually disruptive decor. The offense? A garden flag with her granddaughter's school mascot, a red hawk. "She said the red was emotionally aggressive," Melanie said, laughing bitterly. "You know what's emotionally aggressive: being fined $200 for loving your family." Across the board, Trevor saw the same pattern: petty rules, vague language, escalating fines, and silence. People had stopped waving to each other. Kids weren't allowed to play in the street. There were no community barbecues or block parties, only tension. Garrett put it best: "She didn't just enforce the rules, she destroyed the community. She made us afraid to trust each other." Trevor realized he wasn't the exception. He was just the next one on the list. But unlike many others, Trevor had something Brenda didn't expect: the training, the tools, and the will to document everything. She wanted to break him, but instead, she woke him up. He knew what he was facing now. Not a neighbor with opinions, but a person running a machine of fear. He had a choice. He could keep his head down, or he could expose the machine. Trevor sat at his dining table, laptop open, surrounded by documents, violation notices, printed emails, HOA newsletters, and multiple versions of the CCNRs were laid out like evidence in a courtroom. This wasn't just about fighting fines anymore. This was about unmasking a system that had the look of legality, but the smell of corruption. His first step was a line-by-line comparison between the original 1987 CCNRs, the only version ever filed with the state, and the newer documents Brenda was distributing. At first glance, they looked official. Same formatting, same logo, same section headers. But as Trevor read deeper, a disturbing pattern emerged. Brenda's documents were full of rules that did not exist in the legal version. Where the original CCNRs had basic language about property upkeep, noise hours, dock permits, and boat registration, Brenda's included bizarre authoritarian-sounding terms like community visibility standards, social conduct expectations, emotional atmosphere disruption, intentional disharmony violations. Trevor had to reread them multiple times. Was he in a neighborhood or a psychological experiment? Worse, the language wasn't just weird, it was manipulative. Phrases like subject to immediate non-negotiable penalty and failure to comply constitutes anti-community aggression were littered throughout. She had essentially created a parallel legal system backed by nothing but her authority. Trevor began highlighting every clause in Brenda's document that wasn't in the original. When he finished, more than 60% of the so-called HOA rules were fabricated. And yet, people were paying the fines. They were following the rules because it looked real. Brenda had even forged continuity by referencing page numbers and sections from the original documents. But the citations were twisted. She was taking sentences out of context and attaching new meanings to them. For example, a line that originally read, "Noise should be limited after 10 p.m. to maintain community peace," had been cited in her rules to justify a $250 fine for a neighbor whose dog barked 3 times in one evening. It was calculated deception, and Trevor was just getting started. He then moved on to the HOA's state registration. A quick online search through the Department of Real Estate's portal revealed something shocking. Lakeside Estates HOA was listed as delinquent registration expired. The last official filing? Over 3 years ago, Trevor dug deeper. He filed a public records request for meeting minutes, board member declarations, and financial summaries, all required by law. He received nothing, not even a confirmation email. He asked around. None of the neighbors could recall an HOA election in years. No one knew who the treasurer was. Some had never even seen a board meeting notice. Trevor's stomach turned. Brenda wasn't just bending the rules. She was operating a fraudulent government. She had no board, no registration, no legal authority, but she was issuing fines, collecting dues, installing cameras, and sending threats with the weight of real law behind her words. That's when Trevor remembered something Garrett had mentioned: surveillance. He asked Garrett about the cameras again. Garrett confirmed that a new surveillance system had been installed 2 years ago under the claim of increasing community safety. But the strange thing, no one had ever seen the footage, and the HOA newsletters only mentioned it once, in a vague paragraph about upgraded visibility infrastructure. Trevor walked around the neighborhood and counted 6 outdoor cameras. Two were mounted high on light poles. One was cleverly hidden inside a decorative birdhouse. Another was camouflaged in the trees near Brenda's property, pointed directly at a public path. He returned home and reviewed the financial documents a neighbor had kept from the last known HOA budget. $4,200 spent on community security systems in a single quarter, and yet none of it benefited the community. All the equipment was positioned around Brenda's cabin and property lines. It wasn't about safety, it was about watching them. Trevor began documenting everything: screenshots of expired registration, photos of camera placements, comparisons of original verses, fabricated rulebooks, testimonies from neighbors about bizarre fines and veiled threats. He created a spreadsheet he titled The Manipulation Matrix, tracking how Brenda escalated her tactics over time. Phase 1. Mild fines. Parking violations. Garbage bin placement. Phase 2. Behavior policing. Social conduct violations. Friendliness fines. Phase 3. Psychological enforcement. Surveillance intimidation. Vague threats of legal action. Trevor noticed a chilling pattern. Those who resisted the fines were hit harder. They received double citations, handwritten notices, and were even accused of violating respect codes. One woman, whom Trevor hadn't met before, quietly left a manila folder on his porch. Inside were 8 HOA letters she'd received, all using language Trevor had come to recognize as Brenda's. Your tone in public conversations has been deemed unsettling. Failure to maintain positive demeanor may result in group discomfort fines. It read like something out of Orwell's 1984, but it was happening in real life, on a quiet lake, with pine trees and porches. Trevor realized Brenda didn't need police power to rule. She ruled through confusion, compliance, and fear. And because she looked official, clipboard, printed forms, confident legal language, no one thought to fight her. Until now, Trevor compiled everything into a digital report. Over 80 pages of documentation, images, annotated regulations, and state laws. He saved backups in cloud storage, sent copies to a legal contact from his journalism days, and started reaching out to consumer protection agencies. He was no longer trying to survive Brenda's HOA. He was preparing to bring it down. Trevor had been focused on paperwork and patterns, but now it was time to talk to people. What good was evidence if the victims were too scared to speak? He started with Garrett Fleming again. The retired civics teacher had a calm authority to him, but Trevor could tell he was still shaken. Garrett had printed and laminated his violations like they were war medals: $250 for unlawful decorative saturation, $125 for excessive solar glare from window treatments, and $200 for unscheduled outdoor socializing. "She broke us," Garrett said. "Not all at once, but in tiny pieces. A fine here, a warning there, and the worst part? We let her do it. No one wanted a fight. We just wanted peace." Trevor asked why no one had challenged her. Garrett shook his head. "Because she made the idea of fighting seem scarier than the fines. Everyone just figured it's easier to pay and stay invisible." Melanie Cross, the woman fined for her Red Hawk garden flag, agreed. She had photos of every decor item Brenda had deemed emotionally hostile: a pink flamingo, a peace sign wine spinner, a live, laugh, love garden stone, and a handmade welcome friends sign painted by her grandson. "It stopped being about rules," Melanie said. "It became about who Brenda didn't like." Trevor knocked on over 20 doors. Most people were hesitant. But as word spread that he was documenting the abuse, neighbors started coming to him. At first it was quiet: a folded note on his porch, a voicemail with no name. But then came face-to-face stories. One by one, they opened up. A couple revealed they'd been fined for visual intrusion because their toddler's toys were left on the front lawn. Another woman was told her husband's fishing gear projected a hostile aesthetic. A man who worked night shifts received a $300 penalty for erratic daytime movement. Trevor wrote everything down. Each story shared a common thread: embarrassment, fear, isolation. Brenda had convinced people that being seen was dangerous. Even everyday activities had been weaponized. Watering plants too early, having a colorful front door, putting up string lights. The list of violations grew more absurd with each account. A young woman named Carla had received a fine for operating a non-compliant emotional support display. The supposed offense was a small chalkboard on her porch, where she wrote daily affirmations. She said it disrupted the community's emotional neutrality, Carla said. What does that even mean? Trevor noticed something deeper. The residents weren't just afraid of Brenda. They were afraid of each other. Years of arbitrary enforcement had fractured the social glue of the neighborhood. No one knew who was reporting what. Every interaction became a potential violation. Garrett called it residential authoritarianism, a system where power isn't enforced with violence, but with social shame, fear of being targeted, and the slow erasure of trust. She didn't need to surveil everyone, Garrett said. She just needed us to believe that we were being watched, and that our neighbors would turn us in. Even the mail became a source of anxiety. Trevor heard from one resident who received a fine for postal presentation negligence. His offense? A slightly tilted mailbox. He was told it sent a visual message of disorder. The absurdity would have been laughable if it weren't destroying lives. An elderly couple confessed they had stopped hosting their granddaughter's birthday parties out of fear they'd get fined for unauthorized gatherings. That fear had crept into every corner of community life. Birthday balloons, welcome signs, porch lights, even the volume of laughter at night. It wasn't just about the fines, Melanie said. It was the fear of being next. The silence became survival. Trevor realized Brenda had engineered a psychological trap, isolating neighbors with rules, sowing distrust, and disguising her authoritarianism as community standards. The result was devastating, a place where no one felt safe on their own property. But something was changing. Trevor noticed it first, in the way people lingered a little longer outside, waved again, asked questions. He saw small signs of rebellion. Lawn ornaments reappeared, porch flags fluttered again. Even a kid's bike was left outside overnight. One neighbor handed Trevor a binder. Inside were HOA newsletters dating back 10 years. Highlighted in yellow were subtle rule changes, sentence by sentence, year by year. Brenda had been rewriting the rule book so gradually that most didn't notice. It was a slow boil. And now, people were realizing they'd been cooked. Another man, Peter, told Trevor he had been on the original HOA board years ago. There were elections, there were meetings. We kept it simple, he said. But after my wife got sick, I stepped down. And Brenda, she never stepped aside. Peter hadn't been to a community event in over 2 years. What's the point? He said. She took all the joy out of it. Trevor saw the pain in his eyes, not just at what Brenda had done, but at what had been lost. The sense of belonging, the warmth of shared space. Melanie summed it up best. Brenda murdered the soul of this neighborhood. But something powerful was happening now. The fear was cracking. Garrett called it the awakening. For the first time in years, he said, people are looking each other in the eye. And Trevor understood why. Stories break silence. And stories were now flowing. faster and louder than any fine Brenda could write. With the neighborhood finally beginning to speak out, Trevor knew it was time to go deeper. He wasn't just collecting stories anymore. He was preparing for war. If Brenda's power was built on illusion, he needed to dismantle the illusion at every level. He began with Brenda's background. Her name didn't appear in any public filings as president of the Lakeside Estates HOA. No election records, no board meeting logs, no notarized leadership transition. She had no legal appointment. She simply claimed power, and everyone accepted it because she acted like she had it. That was her first strategy. Confidence as control. Trevor dug into state-level property management databases, curious if this was her first time playing HOA dictator. It wasn't. He found records of Brenda working for a condo complex called Willow Terrace in a nearby town. The name was buried in an old article about a scandal involving abuse of procedural authority. Trevor tracked down the original story. It was worse than he expected. Brenda had been fired from Willow Terrace following an internal audit that revealed financial discrepancies, unauthorized surveillance purchases, and repeated complaints of harassment, including a formal grievance describing her as weaponizing policy language to assert unlawful control. The same tactic, the same pattern, Trevor realized. She had done this before. And Lakeside Estates, with its tranquil setting and conflict-averse homeowners, had been the perfect target for her next act. Next, he turned to the HOA's financials. This was the hardest part. Because the HOA wasn't properly registered, there were no public financial reports. Trevor had to rely on neighbors, digging through old emails, paper receipts, annual statements, handwritten payment logs. It was slow work, but over several days, he pieced together a partial financial history from at least 12 households. The numbers didn't add up. Line items labeled community legal expenses appeared frequently. But when Trevor investigated further, he discovered they were legal bills from Brenda's personal defamation lawsuits. In one case, a neighbor had publicly questioned her authority during a potluck. Brenda sued them for community defamation. The case was thrown out, but she made the HOA pay the legal fees. Then there were payments to a company called Clearwatch Security, listed under Neighborhood Oversight Program. Trevor looked up the company. It was a private surveillance firm run by Brenda's nephew. According to residents, they'd never seen a single security patrol, but the invoices totaled over $7,000 across 2 years. Where had the cameras gone? Trevor knew. He had already mapped 6, each positioned around Brenda's home, angled at specific neighbor properties. Then he found something truly damning. A resident shared a document labeled Board Development Training, 3 days, Crystal Lake Lodge. It showed a $3,200 retreat funded by HOA dues, but not a single board member had attended. Because there was no board, Brenda went alone. The receipt included spa treatments and a bottle of champagne. This wasn't mismanagement. This was theft. Trevor compiled every document, email, and receipt into a master spreadsheet. He color-coded the categories: personal legal expenses, unauthorized tech purchases, fabricated leadership perks. Then he calculated the total estimated amount misused: $18,640. He needed a legal opinion. So he contacted Tracy Wells, a property law attorney he had worked with as a journalist. He emailed her the documents. She called back the next morning, clearly disturbed. "Trevor," she said, "this is criminal, not just civil fraud. We're looking at embezzlement, civil rights violations, and illegal operation of a defunct HOA." Tracy laid out a strategy, Department of Real Estate, to investigate the expired HOA registration and governance violations. State Attorney General's Consumer Protection Division, for financial fraud, deceptive practices, and illegal fine collection. Federal Civil Rights Division. If Brenda's enforcement actions could be shown to disproportionately target certain residents or restrict constitutional rights, federal law would apply. Trevor was stunned, but ready. He wrote a comprehensive master report, 84 pages long, he included. A visual timeline of events, scanned HOA letters, and side-by-side comparisons. Annotated original versus fake CC&Rs, testimonies from 14 residents, photographic evidence of camera installations, financial summary of diverted community funds, a glossary of Brenda-isms, bizarre terms she invented to justify punishments. He sent 3 physical copies via certified mail to each agency. He uploaded a cloud backup, and he kept a separate hard drive stored off-site, just in case. But before the legal dominoes could fall, Trevor decided to test Brenda one last time. He wrote a formal request for access to the HOA's financial records, citing California's Davis-Sterling Act, which guarantees all HOA members access to budgets, receipts, and board meeting minutes upon request. He printed it, signed it, mailed it, certified. 10 days later, he received a response. But it wasn't the records, it was a threat. A formal-looking letter accusing Trevor of harassing community leadership and warning him of legal retaliation for deliberate disruption of residential governance. It was the final piece of the puzzle. Instead of transparency, Brenda chose intimidation. Again, this wasn't a woman trying to protect a community. This was someone trying to protect a lie. Trevor had what he needed. The documents, the witnesses, the motive, the money trail. Brenda had turned a peaceful lakeside community into a fiefdom of fear. She weaponized the language of order to enforce disorder, and she profited, financially, socially, and psychologically, from every fine, every silence, every neighbor too afraid to wave hello. But now, her silence was about to be shattered, not by confrontation, but by evidence. Trevor wasn't just uncovering a scandal, he was unbuilding an empire. With his evidence compiled, Trevor was no longer documenting an abusive system, he was preparing to dismantle it. This wasn't just personal anymore, it was systemic. And if Brenda's empire was going to fall, it would need a strategic legal siege, coordinated, multi-pronged, and relentless. He called Tracy Wells, the property law attorney, and set up a meeting. Not virtual, not over the phone, in person. They met in a quiet office downtown, the kind with thick folders and thicker silence. Trevor laid out the master file on the conference table, 84 pages of printed documentation, backed by hundreds more digitally. Tracy flipped through each section with the calm of someone who had seen a lot. But even she looked up more than once. "This is industrial-scale fraud," she said. "Not HOA overreach, criminal manipulation using the language of authority." They worked late into the night building what Tracy called a 3-tier strike plan. Tier 1. The governance breakdown. Brenda had failed to legally register the HOA. That, on its own, was a serious offense. But she had still acted like the HOA was operational, issuing fines, collecting dues, and modifying rules. Trevor had already filed a complaint with the California Department of Real Estate, but Tracy restructured it, citing specific governance laws, HOA operation codes, and board accountability statutes. She included highlighted clauses showing Brenda's illegal self-appointment, and attached a detailed timeline of her fabricated elections, which, of course, never actually happened. The complaint focused on expired HOA registration, lack of annual meetings, no recorded election procedures, unlawful assumption of board authority. The department had the power to issue fines, dissolve false HOA entities, and bar individuals from future leadership roles. The goal? legally declare the HOA non-operational, thereby invalidating all of Brenda's rules and fines retroactively. Tier 2. The Money Trail. Tracy drafted a formal complaint to the State Attorney General's Consumer Protection Division. This was where Trevor's spreadsheets came in. The receipts, the suspicious line items, the invoices to Brenda's nephew's security firm, the resort charges, the legal expenses charged to residents for her personal battles. It was a full profile of embezzlement disguised as operation. They documented over $18,000 misused, false representation of board activities, use of HOA funds for personal legal defense, false invoices from vendors connected to Brenda's family. Trevor added sworn statements from residents confirming they never approved budgets or knew where the money was going. This wasn't just about getting money back. This was about criminal liability, misappropriation of community funds under the guise of governance. Tier 3. The human cost. Tracy's final push was the most important. A civil rights investigation request. Trevor helped collect statements from over 20 neighbors, but this time the focus wasn't just on rules or money. It was about what people lost emotionally and socially. Residents described how they felt surveilled, silenced, and manipulated. Many shared how Brenda's manufactured authority had made them afraid of each other. Some admitted to therapy. Others spoke of their children being confused about why they couldn't play outside. One woman cried, recounting how her granddaughter asked why she wasn't allowed to have a birthday party because of the mean lady. Tracy compiled these into a dossier addressed to both the State Civil Rights Commission and, depending on findings, the FBI's Civil Rights Division. The charges included harassment through fraudulent authority, violation of freedom of assembly, intimidation using surveillance, psychological coercion of elderly and vulnerable residents. The legal theory: Brenda used a fake HOA infrastructure to violate constitutional protections, which, if proven, could escalate the case to federal jurisdiction. The paper offensive begins. Trevor printed and mailed 3 physical copies of the master report, one for each agency, certified mail, tracked. He backed up the files in encrypted cloud storage and placed a hard copy in a safe. Within 3 weeks, they received confirmation. The Department of Real Estate assigned a compliance officer. The Attorney General's office requested financial clarifications. The Civil Rights Commission issued a notice of review, citing potential merit under Article 3 of the California State Constitution. Trevor felt the ground shifting. The community awakens. News spread quickly, not because Trevor announced it, but because Brenda stopped. No more notices. No more handwritten fines. The cameras, once blinking red, now sat black and silent. For the first time in years, neighbors met in the park. A group of kids played tag without fear. Someone brought out a grill. People brought folding chairs. No one asked for permission. Brenda was still in her cabin, but her power, the invisible web she had spun, had begun to snap. People smiled again. A man who hadn't spoken to his neighbors in 2 years brought cookies to Trevor. Melanie placed a birdhouse on her porch. A subtle act of rebellion. Garrett offered to help organize a town hall. What had been a haunted neighborhood was becoming a community again. Final moves. Tracy filed a motion requesting court-mandated oversight of Lakeside Estates pending investigation outcomes. The motion included a freeze on all HOA fee collections until a legal determination of the HOA's validity. Trevor began receiving emails from reporters, legal organizations, and even a civil liberties nonprofit offering support. A journalist from a major outlet requested an interview, calling it one of the most egregious cases of HOA abuse in recent history. Trevor declined. For now, this wasn't about headlines. This was about healing, and he wasn't done yet. After weeks of emails, certified letters, affidavits, and legal preparation, the most unexpected thing happened. Everything went quiet. No more violation slips under doors. No more flyers about community cohesion initiatives. No more letters with red stamps or obscure references to fabricated HOA bylaws. Just silence. It started slowly. One day, Trevor noticed the absence of Brenda's clipboard. The next day, the newsletter didn't arrive. Then, the blinking red light on the surveillance camera that had loomed over the community notice board was gone, replaced with a static black dot. Even Brenda's car didn't move. For the first time since he moved in, Trevor walked through the neighborhood without feeling watched. But this wasn't a celebration. Not yet. The silence felt too coordinated, too unnatural, like the sound of a school hallway just before the principal arrives, or the breath someone takes before they scream. Trevor didn't trust it, so he kept walking. But this time, it wasn't investigative. It was restorative. He walked without a camera, without a clipboard, no interviews, no notes. Just listening, the neighborhood was coming back to life. Porch swings squeaked again, a wind chime tinkled, a child's laughter echoed down the street, an unfamiliar sound that felt like a miracle. One woman, who had once refused to even make eye contact, now waved him over and asked, "Do you think it's really over?" Trevor didn't answer right away. He didn't want to give false hope. But he said what he felt. Something's changed, that's for sure. Over the next week, he visited homes he'd never entered before. People invited him in, showed him their secret stash of finds. Some had written journals, others had printed emails they never sent, afraid of retaliation. One couple had created an evasion map, a hand-drawn chart of Brenda's surveillance zones, timing patterns, and which neighbors had likely become informants. They laughed as they showed it to Trevor, not because it was funny, but because they were free to laugh again. But the biggest surprise came early one morning. Taped to Trevor's front door was a plain white envelope. No stamp, no label, just his name, written in elegant cursive. He opened it carefully. "Mr. Caldwell," it began, "perhaps we got off on the wrong foot." It was from Brenda, a full handwritten letter. She proposed a private discussion, referring to recent events as a series of unfortunate misunderstandings. She called for a reset of community harmony and offered to collaborate on guidelines moving forward. There was no apology, no acknowledgement of wrongdoing, only a carefully measured tone. Polite, vague, controlled. It was the most revealing thing Brenda had ever sent. Trevor didn't reply. He didn't need to. The letter wasn't a peace offering. It was a signal. Because when tyrants write in cursive, it's not diplomacy. It's desperation. Trevor reread the letter, folded it neatly, and placed it in his file. He understood now. This wasn't the calm after the storm. It was the pressure that builds before it explodes. Brenda had ruled by fear. Now she ruled by silence. But pressure cracks, and when it does, everything underneath comes flooding out. The silence ended on a Tuesday morning. At 9:13 a.m., a plain, unmarked sedan rolled into Lakeside Estates. It didn't have sirens or flashing lights, no agency logos, just a government plate, a calm engine hum, and a driver who didn't look around nervously, because she already knew what she was walking into. Trevor recognized her instantly from the signature on his case file. Linda Martinez, investigator, California Department of Real Estate. She wasn't flashy, khakis, soft blazer, clipboard, ID badge, the kind of person who had authority but didn't need to shout it. She parked beside the warped HOA sign and got out. No rush, no hesitation. She started taking photos, not of people, but of infrastructure. Signage, community bulletin boards, camera placements, entryways. She scanned the horizon like she was assessing terrain. Trevor approached her. "Ms. Martinez?" She looked up. "Mr. Caldwell." Her tone was direct but professional. She shook his hand. "Your documentation," she said, "is one of the most comprehensive HOA submissions I've received in my career. You saved us weeks." Trevor nodded. "It's been a lot." "I can imagine," she said. "And it's not over." Within 30 minutes, she walked up Brenda's steps. Trevor watched from across the street with Garrett and Melanie. No one spoke. Brenda opened the door. Gone was the swagger. Gone was the clipboard. Gone was the stern look of neighborhood dominance. But not the denial. Trevor couldn't hear the words, but he saw the body language. Brenda tried to smile. Linda didn't. She pulled out documents, held them up, pointed to sections. Brenda's smile faded. Her arms crossed. Her face shifted from confidence to calculation, and then to something Trevor had never seen before. Worry. Linda stayed for 40 minutes. The neighbors didn't move. It was like watching a dam crack. When Linda finally walked away, Brenda didn't follow. She closed the door without a word. Linda came straight to Trevor. "Can we talk?" she asked. They sat on Garrett's porch. Melanie joined them. Linda opened a folder, the one with the seal of the Department of Real Estate on the cover. "I want to be clear," she began. "This is more than a violation. Based on what I've seen already, this is systemic misrepresentation and illegal governance. The HOA, as it currently claims to exist, has no legal foundation." Garrett blinked. "So, none of her fines have any legal standing," Linda finished. "They're unenforceable. She's been impersonating a legal entity." Trevor's shoulders finally dropped. Melanie took a breath like she hadn't taken in weeks. Linda wasn't done. She submitted none of the required filings for the past 3 years. There are no meeting records, no budget approvals, no board appointments, and the prior HOA president died in 2019. She never re-registered the entity after that. Trevor frowned. "So, everything after 2019 was fiction," Linda said. She leaned forward. "I've seen this before. HOA takeovers. Usually it's subtle. A little power abuse, petty drama. But what she's done here, it's methodical. You don't fabricate bylaws unless you're building something you know isn't real." Melanie whispered, "She dismantled our community." Linda nodded. "That's typical in fraud-based HOAs. The abuse creates social collapse. You stop trusting your neighbors. You retreat. And the dictator becomes the only structure left standing." Trevor shared what he'd learned. The fines for emotional disruption. The non-compliant social behavior. Accusations. The manipulated CCNRs. Linda was already aware. "That's why I'm here in person. Some of this falls under civil fraud. But when it crosses into psychological coercion and illegal fee extraction, we notify criminal authorities." Trevor's eyes widened. "Criminal?" Linda nodded. "Yes, if it's proven she knowingly used a defunct HOA status to extract money, enforce control, and threaten legal retaliation. That's fraud. If residents were psychologically targeted, we may be looking at civil rights violations too." Melanie leaned in. "What happens next?" "We continue gathering. I'm submitting this for expedited legal review. I'll also be looping in the state AG's office and the Department of Consumer Affairs." Linda stood to leave, but before she did, she looked each of them in the eye. "When this kind of system collapses," she said, "it doesn't go quietly. Be prepared for pushback. But also," she smiled for the first time, "be ready to rebuild." Trevor nodded. He was more than ready. He was resolved. The town hall wasn't flashy. No banners, no grand speeches, just folding chairs in the old community hall, a few clipboards, some lukewarm coffee, and an overhead projector that buzzed faintly every few minutes. But for the residents of Lakeside Estates, it was the most powerful room they had stepped into in years. This was the first real community meeting in over 4 years. Linda Martinez stood at the front, beside 2 other officials from the Department of Real Estate. Garrett arranged the chairs, Melanie passed out printouts of the original HOA bylaws. Trevor sat near the center, his notes in hand, not as a journalist, but as a neighbor. Garrett opened the meeting with just 5 words. "This is your space again." Then silence, and then the flood. One by one, residents stood to speak. Some hesitated, others shook. But the stories came anyway. A father talked about the time he was fined $150 for unsupervised noise. His kids had been laughing on the front lawn, tossing a soccer ball. He didn't fight the fine, just told his kids to play inside after that. "I taught my own children to be quiet," he said, voice cracking, "and I've regretted it ever since." A single mother stood up, holding a string of old holiday lights. Brenda had fined her $75 for cultural inconsistency. The lights were multicolored. "She told me red and green were more acceptable," the woman said. Like joy needed a color code. An elderly woman named Marjorie shared a ledger of fines going back 3 years, over $3,000 in total, her offenses: a garden statue, a hummingbird feeder, a birthday banner. "I paid them," she said, trembling. "I didn't want trouble." Someone gasped. Another man admitted to writing apology letters to Brenda, not because he believed he was wrong, but because he feared escalation. "I was just tired. I just wanted to be left alone." Melanie Cross stood next. She brought out the infamous Red Hawk flag. "Brenda told me it was visually disruptive. I thought it was just a flag. But what it represented to me was my granddaughter. She made me feel like loving my family was a violation." Tears welled in her eyes, but she didn't sit down. "She took our voices," Melanie said, "but not anymore." Then came the deeper confessions, not about fines, but about what had been lost. A young couple confessed they had lived in silence for 2 years, afraid to make friends with neighbors in case they were watched or reported. "We moved here to build a life," they said, "but we ended up hiding in our own home." One man said he had skipped every block party, every neighborhood event, for fear his presence would be deemed subversive. Another described how his son had asked, "Why don't we wave to people like we used to?" No one had answers, until now. Trevor stood last. He didn't bring evidence. He didn't point fingers. He told a story. "The day I moved in, I was stopped before I could unpack. And every day since then, I've been told in one way or another that I didn't belong. But what I've learned is, it wasn't just me. She did it to all of you. And we let it happen because fear makes us forget who we are." He paused. The fines hurt. The silence hurt more. The real damage wasn't financial. It was emotional. We disconnected. We looked away from each other. We lived in whispers. Garrett, sitting near the front, whispered, "That's how you control people. You make them believe they're alone." Trevor nodded. "But we're not alone anymore." Linda stood again. She had heard these kinds of stories before, in other towns, other communities, but she said something different that night. "This," she said, gesturing to the room, "is what rebuilding looks like. It's slow, it's messy, it's full of pain, but it's also the only way forward." Then she turned to Brenda, who, for the first time, sat in the front row, silent. No clipboard, no smile, no notes. Just arms crossed, staring down, no longer the voice of authority. Just another resident, facing the reality she'd spent years denying. No one booed, no one heckled. They didn't need to. Her silence spoke volumes. Linda finished by saying the case had been officially flagged for organized fraud, financial misconduct, and civil harassment under color of authority. The findings would be reviewed at the state level, and the HOA would remain dissolved pending full criminal and civil investigation. But the most important statement wasn't legal. It came from Garrett. As the meeting ended, he stood and simply said, "We are a neighborhood again." Brenda's fall wasn't dramatic. There were no sirens, no news vans, no handcuffs in the street, no viral footage. Just paperwork, court filings, certified letters, and silence. It began with a letter addressed to every household in Lakeside Estates, bearing the seal of the state attorney general. Brenda Thornfield, it confirmed, had been permanently removed from any role or claim of authority within the community. The HOA was officially dissolved, but that wasn't the end. The Attorney General's office held a press briefing the following morning. The charges outlined were extensive: unauthorized collection of homeowner dues, operation of an unregistered HOA, embezzlement of community funds, harassment and intimidation under color of law, deprivation of civil liberties via fraudulent authority. The total estimated misuse? $18,640 in traceable funds, with potentially more pending restitution claims. Brenda was offered a plea deal, and she took it. The terms were strict: full restitution of all verified misused funds, a $15,000 civil fine, a 5-year ban from serving in any HOA, property management, or related oversight capacity, 100 hours of community service to be completed in a neighboring district. In return, criminal prosecution would not proceed to trial. It wasn't jail, but it was justice, slow, procedural, and permanent. But in Lakeside Estates, the biggest change wasn't legal. It was cultural. It was emotional. It was in the way people began to hold their heads higher when walking down their own street. Trevor received dozens of handwritten notes. Garrett and Melanie were approached by neighbors volunteering for new community initiatives. Someone repaired the old swing set. A group of teenagers organized a trash cleanup without being asked. People were relearning what it meant to live without fear. Brenda, meanwhile, stayed in her cabin for a while. She was still there when the Department of Real Estate posted the final audit on the community notice board. A 4-page summary of findings titled "Unauthorized Governance and Abuse of Authority. Lakeside Estates Investigation. Final Report." The most chilling line came at the end. The power structures were illegitimate. The damage, however, was real. The final town hall was quieter than the first. No shouting, no tension, just structure. Linda Martinez presented the full report in person. She thanked the community for their courage and collaboration. She listed every structural violation and financial discrepancy, and matched it with a line from Brenda's now infamous newsletters. She called the entire affair a textbook case of unregulated authoritarian control under the guise of residential governance. Then, she opened the floor to the community. Garrett read a poem. Melanie shared photos from the community's first potluck in years. Trevor spoke briefly, reading a line from his journal. It wasn't just about stopping abuse. It was about remembering what connection feels like. Then he looked across the room. Brenda was there, front row again, arms crossed, but her shoulders were lower now. She wasn't defiant. She was finished. When Linda invited her to speak, she declined, just shook her head. No apology, no speech. No words at all. And no one needed them. Brenda moved out in the spring. No one harassed her. No one gloated. Her house was sold quietly to a young couple with a baby on the way. The new neighbors brought over cookies. Someone helped them hang their welcome sign. No one mentioned Brenda, because Brenda was gone. But the lesson wasn't. The summer that followed was different. Not perfect, but better. And sometimes, better is more powerful than perfect. The first legitimate HOA election in over 4 years was held under state oversight. No confusion, no manipulation, just ballots, counted publicly. Trevor was elected president. Garrett became vice president. Melanie took on the role of social chair, a title she wore with quiet pride. There were no campaign speeches, no slogans, just trust. The trust built through shared trauma, long walks, honest conversations, and one powerful realization. They didn't need a ruler, they needed neighbors. The bylaws were rewritten, not by a firm in Sacramento, but by people on their porches. Trevor hosted open writing sessions every Sunday. Garrett provided history. Melanie brought coffee and cookies. The new document was 12 pages, written in plain English. No loopholes, no ambiguity, just kindness and common sense. The first line read, "We are a community first." Monthly board meetings returned. Open to everyone, each meeting started with a 5-minute gratitude round. Minutes were posted online the same night. Financial records were public. Receipts, budgets. Every cent accounted for. The damaged security system was replaced with a simple gate camera, approved unanimously after community debate. No one wanted to be watched anymore. They wanted to be seen. In August, the community barbecue returned. It wasn't just food, it was rebirth. Neighbors who hadn't spoken in years laughed over grilled corn and lemonade. Kids ran barefoot. Teens played music. Retirees played cards. Someone brought out sparklers. Someone else strung lights from the trees. Trevor stood under the same oak where he'd first been confronted by Brenda, the place where everything began. And he smiled. She had warned him. Don't think this is over. She was right. It wasn't over. It was just beginning. The biggest change wasn't structural. It was emotional. The gates didn't feel like walls anymore. The sidewalks didn't feel like surveillance zones. The mail didn't bring dread. People waved again. People helped each other again. Someone organized a book club. Another started a community garden. A few teens started offering free tech help to older residents. And not because they were told to, but because they wanted to. Trevor never wrote the story for a paper. He had thought he would, that this would be a national expose, a documentary, a viral headline. But when the moment came, he chose differently. Because the real story wasn't about Brenda. It was about what came after. The recovery, the healing, the slow, awkward, beautiful process of learning to trust each other again. He wrote something else instead, just for himself. One line, democracy isn't an event. It's a choice, not a flag, not a rule book, not a vote every few years. A daily, sometimes exhausting, sometimes boring, always powerful choice. To serve rather than control. To listen rather than dictate. To connect rather than surveil. And finally, after everything they had been through, they chose right.